All right, so California Representative Khanna recently sat down with Politico to essentially get into the reasons why he thinks Build Back Better failed to get passed. And honestly, I don't usually like doing videos where I'm just shitting on nominally progressive members of Congress, but unfortunately, they not only refuse to learn the right effective strategies that could have potentially gotten something like Build Back Better across the finish line, but they're actually learning the exact precise opposite lessons that they should be from this entire experience. So let's go ahead and get into this. From Politico, they say Khanna had some Build Back Better advice for the president. Biden called it a homicide. And they say on this week's episode of Playbook Deep Dive, co-author Ryan Lizza and Representative Khanna sit down for burgers and fries while talking about where Democrats went wrong with Joe Manchin and Build Back Better, appearing on Fox News, and what made Bill Clinton and Barack Obama great presidents. Yikes. Okay, so they say Congressman Khanna is one of the most influential progressives inside the House Democratic Caucus. He represents California's 17th district, a large chunk of Silicon Valley. It's wealthy, influential, and home to companies like Apple, Intel, and Cisco Systems. So we're going to read a lot of this, but I think it's important to get a perspective because, again, he basically describes exactly why no good legislation is actually able to get passed, some of the corporate ghouls that are blocking it within the Democratic Party. So they say today, Playbook co-author Ryan Lizza asks Khanna what went wrong trying to pass President Joe Biden's Build Back Better plan and what he thinks progressives' influence on Biden has been. And Khanna also suggests how Democrats can improve their prospects going into the midterms. So here to start us off from Khanna, he says, Biden has a great sense of humor, okay? I don't think that he'd mind sharing this or a sense of humor of putting you at ease. When we were discussing Build Back Better, I said, Mr. President, why don't you just get Bernie Sanders and Joe Manchin in a room to hammer this out? You don't need all these conversations. You could just cut the deal, and whatever those two agree with, that'll be the roadmap. So, okay, not a terrible idea. I would be, perfectly happy to have Bernie Sanders go into a room with Joe Manchin and metaphorically beat the ever-living shit out of him until he falls in line with even a moderately left-wing economic passage. But here was a response from Joe Biden. They say Biden looks at Peter Welch, who is the congressman from Vermont, and says, you know, Roe thinks he knows Bernie because he was the co-chair, but Peter, you and I know Bernie, right? And he says, what Roe's asking for is homicide to put them in a room. And he says, it'd be like, Roe, you and me boxing, I'd beat the hell out of you, but why would we want to see it? So, you know, it's disarming humor and it was in good faith. So he was making a little joke here, but just metaphorically what he's talking about, having Bernie Sanders sit down in a room with Joe Manchin, hammer out the details, figure out exactly what the fuck Joe Manchin is actually willing to get past, that could have been somewhat effective, especially if somebody like Bernie Sanders, in working in coordination with Joe Biden, could have then seen what the pressure points are, noticed that, you know, there's a magic coincidence that millionaire coal baron Joe Manchin has problems with climate change or whatever the other policies may be within Build Back Better. You could have looked at those pressure points and then decided to do a public pressure campaign where you try to get Joe Manchin to fall in line instead of doing these backroom negotiations. But they continue with Ryan Lizza saying, that's actually like a very revealing story about what happened last year. Let's break down why they couldn't do Build Back Better last year. What's your big explanation for what happened? Here's what Khanna said. We should have compromised with Manchin earlier. Should have compromised earlier. I mean, in retrospect, I'm still talking to him. I'm still hoping. So first of all, this is pathetic because Joe Manchin has come out and basically buried Build Back Better numerous different times, dug it back up, buried it back into the ground, and then pissed on its grave. So I'm not really sure why you're just holding out hope, especially if you're not willing to actually use any of the public pressure strategies that you could have been using this entire time to force him to fall in line with what his actual constituents want. And I'll give you guys polling data reminding you of exactly how West Virginia voters feel about Build Back Better. But it's just, pathetic that you're saying that you should have compromised with Manchin earlier. You gave Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema every single thing that they wanted in this piece of legislation. You cut it in half from the original, roughly $6 trillion amount that Bernie Sanders was proposing. They made a compromise. It was $3.5 trillion. That wasn't enough for Joe Manchin or Kyrsten Sinema, so they cut it back down to like $1.75 trillion. And even that, which is essentially a piece of legislation that Joe Manchin wrote himself, even that wasn't enough for Joe Manchin. So obviously, this guy is not willing to work with reasonable compromise. He's just a corrupted actor. But they continue with Lizza saying, I want to get into that. How did it fall apart? And he says, I think the president's numbers turned after Afghanistan when they started to pull back. there was an expectation, a false expectation, that they could just roll Manchin and Sinema and they'd get in line. I think that it was based on the fact that everyone was unified after the American Rescue Plan. So hold on a second. Okay, Joe Biden's approval rating started falling after he left Afghanistan, sure. And, there's a degree to which maybe the Afghanistan withdrawal and the chaos surrounding that and the media onslaught from that could have affected his polling data. But I personally think the disproportionate amount of his polling data, as we've discussed on this channel numerous different times, has come from young people who are jumping ship. And guess what? Young people were overwhelmingly in favor of pulling out of Afghanistan in the same way that young people are overwhelmingly in favor of the items that were within the $3.5 trillion Build Back Better bill. So it's not as much of a, failure with the pullout of Afghanistan as it is, a failure to actually secure material interests for young people who are now turning against Joe Biden after he completely failed to pass all of the semi-major economic proposals that he was putting forward and offering to young people. So it's definitely more of an economic situation than it is tied to Afghanistan. But where exactly was Joe Biden thinking that he could roll over Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema? They never even attempted to roll over Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema. That was the main problem. I mean, they were doing all of these backroom negotiations and trying to guess exactly what Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin wanted from this piece of legislation. I mean, do you guys remember all of the stories that were coming out at this time that were literally just about how Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin won't even publicly state exactly what policies that they are in favor of within Build Back Better? I mean, it was literally a guessing game as to what they were even willing to get passed. And he's talking about this as if Joe Biden was trying to roll over Manchin and Sinema. They weren't rolling over them. They were appeasing them every single step along the process, and that strategy failed. So not exactly sure what the fuck he's talking about there, but they continue saying, if you talk to Manchin, he'll tell you, and I'm not saying anything that he wouldn't say himself, but he had made it clear that he was willing to do certain things in the American Rescue Plan, but that he wasn't willing to do on this Build Back Better. And there was the hope that the momentum and everything will carry it. Ultimately, Manchin usually votes with the party and chips would fall in line. That was a strategic calculation, and that strategic calculation was fucking wrong. So he asks, why was that wrong? And Ro Khanna responds, well, it was wrong because Manchin didn't agree. I don't think there's anyone who, in retrospect, wouldn't say that we should have made the compromise, right? I don't think you should have made the compromise. I think you should have stuck with at least the $3.5 trillion plan and then aggressively gone and done a public pressure campaign to point out the corruption of Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin that is actually their underlying motivations and go on an all-out offensive in order to get them to fall in line. But they never even attempted that strategy, and yet he's still pretending like that was a failed strategy. No, the failed strategy is exactly what you're proposing right now, which is cozying up to Manchin and Sinema and pretending as if they're acting in good faith. But they say, when you look back, was there a moment where you think, shit, that's the moment we should have cut a deal with the White House and Manchin? There was a window. And he said, before the end of the year, something went off. I'd been having conversations for 6 months, 7 months, constructive conversations with Manchin. Were they really constructive? Because you didn't get anything out of it. And they said, you were personally? And he says, yes, and we have a good rapport. And he says, have you been on the houseboat? Talking about Manchin's, $1 million houseboat that he has. And he says, no, I have not been on the boat. He invited me because I've been passionate about getting these tech jobs into rural communities. And so I went to Beckley, West Virginia. We had spent 45 minutes together in 2017 where he was talking about the state, and he loved the idea of having these tech jobs come to Beckley. Gordon G., who is the president of West Virginia University, is close to him. I've helped him get support in Silicon Valley. And he says, I've had a relationship with Manchin, and I've never questioned his motives or questioned his word in the process. Why not? Why not? That's a fucking problem. This is somebody who is one of, if not the single most corrupt members within your party, and you think that he's acting in good faith? You've never even questioned his motives when we know that he comes out and says ghoulish shit like this all the time, just on the expansion of the child tax credit. What was his reasoning? Was it a good faith reasoning based on what his West Virginia constituents wanted? No, he was coming out and using like fucking ghoulish lines from the 90s, saying that Manchin privately raised concerns that parents would use the child tax credit checks on drugs. This was just not only ghoulish, but also factually wrong. We saw all of the data that clearly showed that parents were spending this money on shelter, on food, on school supplies, etc. And he comes out and says some shit like this. This is somebody you think is acting in good faith, Ro Khanna. But he continues here saying, look, we have disagreements, but he's coming from a place of his philosophy. and we've got to find a compromise. And so he's always said he wants to work and come to a compromise. I thought we had a lot of momentum before the end of the year, and then something went wrong. He says, I really believe that Manchin does want to come to an agreement, but that moment is different at different times, right? What? So there have been moments where he wants to. I don't know where he is now, but there have been those moments, and we got to figure it out. What the fuck does this even mean? Either he's for some policies or he's not for some policies, and then you could figure that out. Get specific with it. But he's just talking about at different times, he has different opinions. Okay, so he's wildly inconsistent in what his supposed moral philosophy is, as Khanna is describing it. He doesn't have a fucking political philosophy. His philosophy is acting on behalf of the corporate America donations that flood into his campaign coffers and put him in the position that he's in right now. And his moral philosophy is looking after his own personal financial interests, which, just as a reminder, this is a guy who owns a dirty coal company, okay? A dirty coal company that he personally helped get up and running using his position as a state senator within West Virginia, got a coal plant up and running, started selling to that coal plant, then upcharged his own constituents on their electricity bills to increase his own personal profits. That's how he got his political career started within West Virginia, and he still makes hundreds of thousands of dollars off of this dirty coal company that he started in one of the most corrupt ways possible. This is somebody that you think is willing to compromise. This is somebody you think is looking after his constituents. He's not looking after his constituents. He's looking after Joe Manchin. But just as a reminder here, coal-friendly Manchin becomes top Democrat on the Senate Energy Committee. And also, simultaneously, would you look at this, Joe Manchin has made millions from coal, and his ties are now facing examination as Democrats scramble for a climate and economic agreement. And then, wow, I wonder if there's a correlation between these things. Joe Manchin's objections to a clean energy program threatens Biden's climate provisions. So, okay, so you have a senator who is sitting on the climate committee, the energy committee that gets to determine climate legislation. He's making millions of dollars from a dirty coal company, and he's also one of the, if not the single top recipients of fossil fuel donations. And on top of that, he's opposing all of the major climate provisions. I wonder if there's a through line here. I wonder if there's some correlation or connection between his personal interest in maintaining and protecting the fossil fuel industry, his own personal financial ties to that industry, and then opposing things that would be good for the planet and good for the economy and good for average Americans, but would also simultaneously hurt the same fossil fuel industry that he is profiting from. I wonder if there's a correlation there. Call me crazy, but just as a reminder here, it's not just the overall American people who are against what Joe Manchin is doing here by blocking Build Back Better. It was also specifically fossil fuel workers within West Virginia. So the exact constituency that Joe Manchin is pretending to represent, these, great old West Virginia coal miners, he doesn't give a shit about average West Virginia coal miners. And all you need to do to understand that is look at what the fuck they were asking for. So here from Sierra Club, coal miners weren't happy when Joe Manchin derailed Build Back Better. The United Mine Workers of America issued a statement criticizing the senator for withdrawing his support from the legislation. So even West Virginia coal miners were in favor of this legislation, and West Virginia constituents overall were in favor of the $3.5 trillion Build Back Better plan. And honestly, it wasn't even fucking close. I mean, I've showed this poll a million different times at this point, but a majority of West Virginia voters support the provisions of Build Back Better plan. Below is a list of some of the provisions in the $3.5 trillion investment plan, and you go one by one. Investing in long-term care, that's plus 78, and this isn't just Democrats, this is overall West Virginia voters. Expand Medicare coverage, plus 70. Child care investments, plus 53. Extend tax cuts for families, plus 48. Paid family and medical leave, plus 46. Universal pre-K, plus 42. Extend the ACA subsidies, plus 40. Clean energy investments, plus 28. Okay, 60% of West Virginia constituents support the clean energy provisions that Joe Manchin is blocking. Okay, so it's not a matter of him being principled on his moral philosophy or representing average West Virginia coal miners. They're saying the exact opposite of what Joe Manchin is saying that they want. Okay, so he's not acting in good faith. He's just a fucking corrupt senator, and one of the most corrupt senators within your own party. But they continue to say, I was going to say, what's the reaction to like your fellow CPC, Congressional Progressive Caucus members? And he says, It was a hard no, probably back in September of last year. It's softer by November and December, and now the latest article I saw in Politico, where a lot of members are now okay, we're willing to compromise, and I believe to this day that if the president comes to a deal with Manchin and it's reasonable, you will get a couple progressives behind it and the thing will pass. Is this really the reality that we want? We want progressives to just appease whatever the fuck the most far-right millionaire coal baron senator within their party wants? Is that what the progressives are supposed to be doing in Congress right now? No, you're supposed to be dragging Joe Biden to the left, and instead you're basically saying our strategy is to bend over and give this millionaire coal baron every single thing that he wants, which, guess what, even when you do that, it's still not going to be enough for him, okay? He's a corrupted ghoul. He doesn't give a shit about West Virginia constituents. He's not listening to them, and it's very clear that he's not listening to them in the data. So again, it's just a delusional take to have here. But finally, they say, I wonder if you could take us through a little bit of what the range of strategic advice is within the Congressional Progressive Caucus. You often seem to me to have a different approach to making the case for the progressive point of view than some of your colleagues. You talk about compromise and giving Joe Manchin a pen and not questioning his motives. And he says, what did we do wrong? I think when we attack people like Manchin, in some ways, we're attacking his voters. Instead, I think we have to also listen and say, what are we missing? Why is it that so many parts of the country are upset? And how are we going to respond in a constructive way to them? Okay, do you understand how fucking delusional this take is? I mean, again, I just showed you the data. West Virginia constituents, including West Virginia coal miners, overwhelmingly supported the $3.5 trillion Build Back Better plan. And that's not even to say, the pared down, half-assed $1.75 trillion one. That's an entirely different picture. But they supported the bigger package, okay? Not even the watered down one that Joe Manchin essentially got his pen out and wrote himself, okay? They supported the larger spending plan that was put forward by people like Bernie Sanders. And Khanna is looking at this situation and saying, the problem is we attacked Joe Manchin too much. No, it's the exact opposite of that. And you're not attacking his voters, you're attacking his corruption, okay? And all you would have to do to understand this dynamic is look at what the fuck West Virginia voters want. I mean, again, there's this delusional mindset that people have that, oh, well, he comes from West Virginia and, West Virginia overwhelmingly voted for Trump. So I guess that they're against every single, piece of economic policy that could possibly materially improve their lives. No, that's not the case. Even people in West Virginia, even the most stereotypical, right-wing idea of what Joe Manchin portrays as his constituents, the coal miners of West Virginia, even they are in support of bold economic left-wing reforms. So why the fuck would you not be using that to your advantage? The entire strategy that you are putting forward right here of being nice to Joe Manchin and appeasing him every step along the way was an abject failure, okay? And meanwhile, you were giving up your main point of leverage in this entire conversation, which is to point out the corruption that Joe Manchin is putting on full display. That's your main point of leverage, is to go to West Virginia, bring up coal miners on stage, let them give a speech, let them express the fact that they support the larger $3.5 trillion Build Back Better plan. Let them get up there and explain how Joe Manchin only cares about his, personal financial interests and doesn't care about average West Virginia coal miners or average West Virginia constituents. We're talking about one of the poorest states in the entire country. You think that they don't want economic relief for themselves and their families to be able to put food on the table, to be able to send their kids to college, to be able to just take care of themselves and their families? Do you really think that they don't want that? Of course they do. So that's the strategy you should have been going with this entire time. And honestly, it's just pathetic that this is a conclusion that so-called progressives within Congress are going with, because even if you have the right policy beliefs, if you're not going to implement it with effective strategies, then you're fucking useless. I mean, literally his proposed strategy here is, let's give the most far-right member of our party complete control over the legislative agenda and then just do whatever the fuck he wants. That's not what your strategy is supposed to be right now.